Okay, so we're going to take a look at leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells, and they basically travel in the circulatory system, but they're going to perform their functions or their job in the tissues. So they use the bloodstream as their mode of transportation, and then when they get to the area that they want to exit, they're going to slip through the endothelial cells that make up the capillaries, so the simple squamous cells, through a process called diapedesis, and they're going to go out into the tissues and carry out their functions. They are signaled by what we call CAMs, or cell adhesive molecules, and those are kind of like little flags, and they say, okay, this is where you need to exit into the tissues and come out here and do your job. So we've looked at the formed elements, we've talked about the erythrocytes, now we're looking at the leukocytes. You can further categorize the leukocytes into two categories, and that's dependent on whether they have visible granules or granules that are not very visible. So granulocytes are the leukocytes that have visible granules, and a granule is just a membrane-bound sac that contains some kind of chemical or something in it that allows it to carry out its functions. Agranulocytes do not have visible granules. They still have granules, but they're just not visible when you stain them and look at them under a microscope. Okay, so if you're looking at the leukocytes, as I said, you can categorize them into granulocytes or agranulocytes. So the best way to remember it, and I'm going to do a dividing line here, is that the granulocytes end with "phil." So you have eosinophils, can't spell granulocytes, okay. You have eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils. And as far as the agranulocytes, they end in "cyte." So you have monocytes and lymphocytes, and there's basically two types of lymphocytes. You have T lymphocytes, or T cells, and B lymphocytes, or what we call B cells. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about those in greater detail. Okay, so if we want to first look at the granulocytes, we're going to take a look at neutrophils. So a neutrophil, those are the most numerous of the white blood cells. They're considered the first responders. Their job, they're huge phagocytes. So their job is to phagocytize and engulf a bacterium, and to get rid of it that way. So we'll talk about phagocytosis, and we'll look at actually all the leukocytes. We talk a lot more about these when we get into the immune system. So we're just doing a general introduction at this time. So that's a neutrophil. First responders, the most numerous of the leukocytes. Eosinophils, they have granules that stain red. So these are easy to identify in a microscope because they have orange or red staining granules in them. Their job basically is to get rid of parasitic worms and any antigen that's too large for other white blood cells to phagocytize. You also would see eosinophils, they're going to be present in an allergic reaction, but their main job is to fight the body against parasites like tapeworms, flukes, pinworms, hookworms, etc. Basophils, so you can't see the nucleus here, but the basophils, they're the rarest of the white blood cells. Their granules are deep blue to purple staining, so you really can't see much of the nucleus. They kind of hide the nucleus because there's so many granules. Their job, basophils are present during inflammation. So they kind of initiate the inflammatory response by releasing chemicals called histamine and heparin. And so their job basically is to initiate the inflammatory response. As far as the agranulocytes, these are the lymphocytes and the monocytes. So the lymphocytes are can be further categorized into, there's a couple different types, but the main ones are what we call T cells. You also have B cells, B lymphocytes, and then you have another type called NK cells, or natural killer cells. And we'll talk again more about those when we get into the immune system. So those are the lymphocytes. They can be found in lymphoid tissue, lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, tonsils, etc. And their job is to function in the immune response. So, for example, B cells produce antibodies, and T cells are responsible for cell-to-cell combat. And when you get into the immune system, we'll talk about those in great detail. The last type of leukocyte we're going to talk about is a monocyte. They are the largest, so think of mighty monocyte. They are the largest of the white blood cells. When they enter tissues, they further differentiate and become a macrophage, which is a very large phagocytic type cell, and their job is to ingest or phagocytize foreign substances, anything that's really kind of too large for the neutrophils and other phagocytes to break down. So it could be a virus, it could be a fungus, it can be a protozoa, it could be dead neutrophils, but that's basically their function. Okay, so the process of leukopoiesis is the process of leukocyte production. So as you can see here, you're starting with the same stem cell called a hemocytoblast. They're going to receive a chemical signal called a cytokine. And a cytokine they're released in response to chemical signals that are occurring during the immune response. So when other leukocytes release a chemical, it's going to cause the release of a cytokine. And as I said, we'll talk more about this when we get into the immune response. As far as leukopoiesis goes, so the chemical is going to be a cytokine. You can see that it's going to differentiate into either a myeloid stem cell or a lymphoid stem cell. You don't have to know all these names. The difference is a myeloid stem cell is where the granulocytes, so here's the fills, they all come from a myeloid stem cell. The lymphoid stem cell is going to further differentiate into a B lymphocyte or a T lymphocyte. And a monocyte also comes from a myeloid stem cell. Okay, so the only ones that come from the lymphoid stem cell are the B cells, the B lymphocytes, and the T lymphocytes.